Your Honour, we have 5 witnesses today who are here to speak to us about current practices in formation.
You all need to be sworn. Would you take an oath on the Bible, all of you?
2 of us.
All of you will take an oath on the Bible? Yes. Could you all stand for me? Make sure you've got a hand on the Bible. And then together repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give to this Royal Commission.
That the evidence I shall give to this Royal Commission.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Take a seat again.
Thank you, Your Honour. Sister, if I could start with you, could you please tell the Commission your full name?
Sister Lydia Allen.
Thank you. And Sister, you're a member of the Religious Sisters of Mercy of Alma?
Correct.
And you made your final profession in the Religious Sisters in 1989, is that right?
Yes, 1989.
How long was your process of training and formation?
It was 8 years.
Thank you. And was that all in the United States?
Yes. I did do some, I was already a psychologist when I entered, and so I was doing some teaching and training of other psychologists and medical doctors in Europe during parts of that time, but basically it was in the United States.
Thank you. Now, you hold a PhD in psychology.
Yes, I do.
You have served as a consultant to the Vatican Congregation for Catholic Education.
Yes, that's correct.
What was that body?
What was that body?
Yes.
At that time, the Congregation for Education was in charge of seminarians in the seminaries, and so it was in that, for that reason that I was asked to be a consultant, because I had worked with many seminarians and priests.
That work is now done by a different body called the Congregation for Clergy, is that
Correct, yes.
So are they responsible for preparing the documents that are issued by the Vatican from time to time?
Yes.
So the document that's called the Ratio Fundamentalis, is that drafted by that body?
I'm not sure. That was, I think, through this last one was from Pope Francis. Yes.
Thank you. What work are you doing at the moment, Sister?
I am the human formator, the director of human formation at the Seminary of the Good Shepherd. So I work there, I teach, I do the assessments, and I do counseling there.
Thank you. Where's the seminary?
In Homebush.
Thank you. Now, I think the Royal Commission's received indications that the seminary at the moment has 32 seminarians. Is that right?
Well, we now have more, including those who are out in pastoral work, and we have a rather large group of new seminaries coming in the first year, so we're almost up to 50.
Thank you. And so they're spread across 6 years of study, is that right?
About 7.
7. And their ages range from, do you know how old the youngest seminarian is?
Probably 18 through 35.
Thank you. How long have you been involved with the Good Shepherd Seminary?
For 8 years.
Are you aware how much the numbers have changed in the seminary over, say, the last couple of decades?
Yes.
What's been the pattern?
Well, that was before my time here, but are you talking internationally or are you talking about here?
Well, can we focus firstly on the Good Shepherd Seminary?
I'm not all that familiar with the statistics.
What about during your time?
During my time, we are increasing.
Thank you. Do you have any idea of whether the priests that are being produced out of the seminary, well, firstly, where do they go to work?
In various parishes. They are assigned to various parishes.
All within the Archdiocese of Sydney?
No, because they're not all from Sydney. Some of them come from different dioceses, so they would go back to their home diocese. they will also, during the time of their formation, go to their home diocese for pastoral formation, for example, for pastoral work in different parishes. And when they complete it, they are ordained in their own diocese, and then they return to their own diocese.
Are those dioceses all within New South Wales?
We have Canberra-Goulburn, and we have Wollongong. We have various dioceses, yes.
You may have heard yesterday, sisters, some reference to the use of foreign priests in various dioceses around the country, and the suggestion was that they are needed because of a lack of homegrown priests to serve the needs of various dioceses.
Yes.
Do you have a sense of whether your seminary is, for the diocese that it services, producing the numbers that are required to act in service?
Well, there is the statement of that there's always more work to be done than can be done. There are always more places for good priests. And so we're doing our best to form good and solid young priests and older priests. And so I don't know whether we will fulfill all of the requirements that are needed for the formation of priests in the diocese, but we're doing our best. And there are others also who are working also within the diocese. So,
thank you, Sister. Father Thompson, could I turn to you, please? Could you firstly tell the Commission your full name?
My name is Peter David Thompson.
Thank you. And Father, you're a member of the Congregation of the Mission, otherwise known as the Vincentian Fathers. You have been since 1960, is that right?
That's right.
Now, Vincentians have a particular calling to priestly formation, is that right?
That was one of their calls, yes.
You are also ordained as a priest, is that right?
Father, I'm sorry, before you answer, that microphone that's in front of you there, can you bring it across? I think it'll move. And talk into it if you would. Bend it down if not.
Okay. Would you repeat the question?
I'm sorry, I was asking you, you're also an ordained priest.
Yes, I've been a priest for 50 years.
Right. And you've served as a parish priest in various parishes around the country, is that right?
A parish priest or an assistant priest, yes.
And you've served as the superior of your community in Western Australia for a period of time?
6 years, yes.
What's your current position?
Currently, I'm the rector of the diocesan seminary in the Diocese of Wagga Wagga, known as Biani College.
How long have you been in that position?
14 years.
Can you tell us a little about the college and what diocese it serves?
Yes, the college was founded by Bishop Brennan in 1992 as a diocesan seminary. There was a certain amount of controversy at the time. Bishop Brennan had two main reasons, I think. The one he gave publicly was that he wanted to train his priests in the country. The priests that serve in country parishes need a different kind of training to what they get in the city seminaries. 1992 was also, I think, the low point in morale and in certainly there were problems in both Sydney and Melbourne. That has since changed, thankfully. So it struggled for a start. I think Bishop Brennan had trouble getting adequate staff, formation staff and academic staff. But it did good work. There was quite a number of young men came to it originally. Not all of them were ordained, but at least they tried their vocation. By the time I was asked to become rector in 2004, there was a new bishop, Bishop Gerard Hatter, and the numbers of seminarians were down to 4. And he warned me, he said, if it doesn't become viable, we'll have to close it. He says, your challenge is to make it viable. I foresaw one thing immediately, that a small diocese like Wagga Wagga could not provide seminarians to make a viable seminary. So we needed to turn to other country dioceses who had similar problems, or similar needs rather than problems, and make even though it remains a diocesan seminary under the Bishop of Wagga, to welcome and to train seminarians from other, particularly country dioceses. And we have moved in that direction. So to answer your final question, at the moment we have, I'm just going from memory, 10 seminarians for the Wagga diocese, 8 for Lismore. At the moment we have none from Armidale, though there are some I think we could have at least in 12 months' time. We have 1 for the Melkite eparchy, and we have 4 religious order men from a Vietnamese congregation, the Association of St. Anthony, and 2 training for the Confraternity of Christ the Priest, another diocesan-based religious community, or Association of Christ Faithful based in Wagga. I think I've covered them all. There should be 25 when you add all those up.
Do you have some other candidates from overseas that you're training?
Yes, more than half of them were born overseas. The Vietnamese I mentioned will return to Vietnam, but the countries they come from cover Nigeria, Kenya, India, Philippines, Vietnam, Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Father. When you were talking about the establishment of the seminary, you alluded to issues in Melbourne and Sydney. Can you just elaborate a little on what was going on in Melbourne and Sydney that prompted the establishment of the seminary?
Not in great detail. The general word around among the clergy was that that there was very little discipline in both those seminaries. Their numbers were very low, which kind of indicated low morale. There were complaints also about the orthodoxy of some of the some of the classes, the theology and other disciplines that they were learning. But I'm just going on hearsay. I can't elaborate on that any further.
Does the college still have a reputation for having greater discipline or orthodoxy than other seminaries?
I think so. I mean, some of you would be aware of our discipline, our reputation more than I am, but the general impression I get is that yes, we insist on some old-fashioned discipline and orthodoxy. I don't know about more than others. I'm quite convinced that the other seminaries now are all on the right path.
And do you have a sense, Father, of whether the priests who are being ordained after being trained at your seminary are providing the numbers required in the various country dioceses that you refer to?
In Wagga, we're kind of replacing, I guess, those who are retiring, and possibly numbers have dropped. but we're barely replacing, I suppose. I hesitate. I know Armidale is facing great difficulties at the moment. Lismore, there are a handful that will be ordained for Lismore in the near future. So we are meeting to some extent the requirements, but probably not as much as the bishops would hope for, would wish for.
Do you know if each of those dioceses also uses priests who have been ordained overseas to fill parish roles?
In Wagga, we normally don't get ordained priests from overseas. Our priests that were born overseas have gone through Vianney College and have trained there, and in doing so attained a large amount of acculturation with the local scene. I think the other dioceses I've mentioned do have some that they've recruited directly from overseas.
Thank you. Father Hogan, if I could ask you, Father Thompson, to pass the microphone. Thank you, Father. Can I ask you to state your full name, please?
John Michael Hogan.
Thank you. And Father, you were ordained in England, is that right?
That's correct, yes, 1981.
Thank you. And you came to Australia in the 90s?
Yeah, 1995.
And you served as a parish priest and in various other roles. In which diocese, Father?
In Parramatta.
Thank you. Now, you hold a degree in psychology?
That's correct.
And you're...
I'm not a clinical psychologist.
Right. You're also studying for a master's in psychology, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
What's your current position, Father?
I'm the rector of Holy Spirit Seminary in the Parramatta Diocese.
Thank you. Can you tell us a little about firstly, how long have you been in that role?
This is the beginning of my 10th year in that role.
Can you tell us a little about the seminary, including what diocese it serves?
Well, up until this year, it's only served the Parramatta Diocese, but we were approached by Bishop Tarabay of the Maronite Rite to take 2 of his students, and the bishops were agreeable to that, and I was happy to do that. So we now have 2 Maronite seminarians.
Thank you. And how many seminarians do you have in total?
18.
How old's your youngest seminarian?
18.
And what at the upper end of the range?
About 35, 36.
Thank you. Do you have seminarians who are born overseas?
3.
Which countries are they from?
India. 1 from India and 2 from the Philippines.
Thank you. What's the experience been like in your seminary over your time for the last 10 years? Have numbers changed much from year to year?
I'm sorry, I missed the question.
Have the numbers in your seminary changed much since you came in 2008?
Yes, 2008 there was a larger increase. We had about 12 seminarians, and then it kind of hovered around that number for a few years, and then about 4 years later dropped to, I think there was only 5 in the seminary 1 year, and then again we got increased intakes each year after that. So this is the largest number we've ever had.
Thank you. And does the Parramatta Diocese also use the services of priests who've been ordained overseas?
Yes, it does.
What countries are your priests from?
Oh, I couldn't be exactly sure, but there's a lot of people from India, some from Vietnam, certainly a couple from Korea, some from various African nations.
So ordained in each of those countries?
Yes.
Thank you. Father Kelly, if I could turn to you, please. Can you state your full name?
Brendan James Kelly.
And you're a Jesuit priest, Father?
I am.
You've been part of the Jesuit order since you were 18, is that right?
That's correct.
Thank you. How long was your own formation as a Jesuit before you took your final vows?
From 1970 to 1993.
Thank you. And you've held various teaching and leadership positions in Jesuit schools for about 25 years or so, is that right?
Over that period, yes.
Thank you. You hold a Diploma of Education and a Masters of Education.
Yes.
What's your present position, Father?
Presently, I am the Novice Director and also the Province Delegate for Jesuit Formation.
Can you just explain a little what's involved in each of those two positions?
The Novice Director is it's the first 2 years once a candidate has been accepted into the society. And so I have care of their training over those 2 years. And in terms of the Provincial Delegate for Jesuit Formation, I oversee the formation program from novitiate through to mostly through to post-ordination and tertiarship.
Thank you. How long have you been the Provincial Delegate?
I've had that job for 4 or 5 years. Yeah.
Thank you. And the position as the Director of Novices, how long have you been in that position?
This will be my 11th year.
Thank you. Where is the novitiate now for the Jesuits?
The novitiate now is housed in the Parramatta Diocese. It's 2 houses, 2 suburban houses in the suburb of Emerton, which is part of the Holy Family Parish, which is conducted by the Jesuits on behalf of the diocese.
Thank you. Now you've provided a statement to the Commission, and you've indicated in that statement that the process of formation for a Jesuit priest or brother is markedly different from the formation process for a diocesan priest. Can you perhaps just outline the key steps in that process?
In the process, yes, I think. Well, to begin with, there's a period of candidacy after inquiry and acceptance to candidacy. There's a period of no less than 12 months, and then there's a formal interviewing to be admitted to the novitiate. The novitiate is usually a period of 2 years, and then there's a period of 3 years after novitiate called First Studies, and that takes place in Melbourne, and they will do some study there, Catholic Theological College now, and in preparation, and they might do, if they look as though they might be heading towards experience of teaching, then we would, during that period, they would get a DipEd, a Diploma in Education. And then, this is where it differs a little bit. After those 3 years, a Jesuit would go into a Jesuit ministry, and that would be like a hands-on. It's the first full experience, full time, of being engaged in a Jesuit ministry. So it might be working in a school, and they do that for 2 to 3 years, and then after that they would apply for theological studies, and then if they're being accepted to theological studies, then recently, over the last 3 or 4 years, we have directed them to study theology at Boston College in Massachusetts. So they would go there to study their theology, and then when they finish their theology, they apply for ordination, diaconate and ordination, priest ordination, They may go on to further study, or they may go into a pastoral year or so, or they may be sent to ministry, and they may do that for 4 or 6 years, and then they will come into what we call tertianship, which is a 7-month. It's a full year really, but it's the program in itself is over 7 months, which brings Jesuits from all over the world. Given that we're an international order, brings Jesuits together from all over the world to really to revisit how they're travelling, where they are, what's happening, and where they might be heading in the future. So it's a new formative experience for them as well. And basically, they repeat some of the things that happen in the novitiate, or they go through some of the same experiences. Yeah.
Is that the final stage before final vows?
And then there's another period when they're finally invited to take final vows, which is really then the society's acknowledgement of full incorporation into the society. So that's why I mean it's a fairly lengthy period of formation. I was interested in Dr. Anson's statement about having that period of shortening the formal formation, if you like, and giving them some experience. Well, I think our Regency does that, does help work towards that, because you actually do reflection with them on that experience, and it's a key one in leading up to, I think, making application to theology, which is really saying you want ordination.
Thank you. You've also referred in your statement to what are called the experiments.
Yes.
Can you just explain a little when they occur and what they are?
The experiments are like placements which occur during the novitiate period of the two years. And traditionally there's been 6 of them, but you're not held to that. You can have 4 or 5, and you can have varied experiences. But this is where the novices will actually be sent to a place and to engage it for anything between 6 and 10 weeks, and they'll be under supervision and that. But it's really about comfort zones, finding oneself in new situations, because part of our charism is that we're not necessarily confined to one place. A Jesuit can be sent anywhere in the world. So we want the formation to be, we want people in formation that are adaptable and flexible like that. So these experiments provide that, and also help to test, whether this is really what the life that I want to lead.
How many have you got in the novitiate at the moment?
At the moment, there's 5. Yeah.
Thank you. What's their range of ages?
About 57 to 27.
Thank you. What's the youngest that the Jesuits these days will accept people for formation?
I'm not sure of the age, but it's got to be in their 20s, and it's usually after they've completed some degree. But they're not accepted as formally. They're not accepted straight from school.
Is there a formal requirement that they have some tertiary education before they apply?
It's not a formal requirement, but if they have, it's helpful, because they will probably end up doing some extra study to get that requirement. So we tend to accompany them if they're interested while they're doing their studies. We tend to accompany them, and then after they've finished their studies and they're still wanting to apply, then they do.
Do you reject a lot of applications?
Yes.
Can you give us a sense of the proportion?
Well, just reject is interesting. You might put somebody on hold for various reasons. So, but if let's say 3 apply, 1 will be accepted. That's what's happened this year.
Thank you. Dr. Leary, if I could turn to you, can you state your full name, please?
David Andrew Leary.
Thank you. And Doctor, you're a Franciscan friar, is that right?
I am.
You spent some years in the seminaries at Springwood and Manly, is that right?
I did 4 years.
Thank you. But didn't proceed to ordination.
True.
How old were you when you joined the Franciscans?
In my 50s. 54.
What were you doing before that?
Going back a little bit, so when I left the seminary at the end of 1977, I worked for 12 months as a male nurse at Sacred Heart Hospice, which at that stage was completely a palliative care unit. And during that time I was volunteering in the parish of St Francis, where the De La Salle brothers had established a youth centre. And during that 12 months of working as a male nurse and also volunteering, they suggested that I might continue to work with them. So on December the 14th, 1978, I decided to stay with the youth centre, which was called the Come In Centre, under the auspice of St Francis Welfare. As it was then, it's since become St Francis Social Services. And I worked there in a number of capacities for 32 years. During that time, I finished my theology and philosophy. I did a master's in counselling, and then finally I did a PhD in health psychology. The latter 2 degrees were at the University of New England. And my principal role besides being the director of the centre at Paddington, I was also employed there as a counsellor.
Thank you, Doctor. And what's your current occupation?
I have a couple of different roles. My substantive role is, as of November last year, was I'm now Secretary of the Province for the Franciscans in Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Malaysia, Brunei. I think that's it. And in that role, I handle anything from the administration of the province, our liaison with Rome, and complaints of sexual abuse. I'm the first contact person for that. And dealing with the process, I'm the contact person within the Franciscans for dealing with matters of sexual and physical abuse. I'd be the one who represents the Franciscans at mediation sessions, which I did. My first one with the Franciscans a couple of weeks after I started in the role. I think what for me is perhaps the most interesting aspect of that is that for a very significant period of time, I was on the other side of the coin. So my work at Paddington, where we assisted homeless young people, survivors of sexual abuse and physical abuse, young people involved in the criminal justice system, and young people involved in prostitution, both male and female. I was fairly heavily involved in the Royal Commission into the New South Wales Police Service, the Wood Royal Commission, in its paedophile reference, assisting victims, young people who had or were homeless, if they were called to give evidence. So that's, I think that's the background that led me both to join the Franciscans, but also why I've ended up in this role. My other substantive role is, it's a secondary role now, is that I teach at university, and my teaching areas are in pastoral ministry, pastoral theology. So I'll continue to do that throughout this year, maybe next year as well, on a part-time basis. And I teach two significant units, foundations of pastoral practice and professional issues in pastoral practice.
So do the students who take those courses include people who are in the seminaries?
Yes. And a variety of religious orders.
How long have you been doing that teaching?
I first started teaching at Australian Catholic University around similar issues in 2008. I've been assisting at and teaching at the University of Divinity for the last couple of years. Prior to that, my full-time role when I was in Melbourne was I was the manager of the asylum seeker program for Catholic care, which involved assisting young people and unaccompanied minors and families from Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, Iran, Iraq, Vietnam, who came here by boat. And so we were providing accommodation and allied health services. So I headed up a team and was quite involved and have maintained some involvement in that area.
Thank you, Doctor. Are there any Franciscans currently undergoing formation?
No, not in Australia. In Singapore, Malaysia, there are, I think, 12 or 13.
If you had someone within Australia present as a candidate for formation, where would they go?
In their first year, in their postulancy year, it would probably be in a parish here in Sydney as an observer. In their novitiate year, it would be in the United States. The English-speaking conference of the Franciscans has a combined novitiate. It was in California. It's since moved to Burlington, Wisconsin, I think. But there is talk of it moving back to California.
Thank you.
And that would be a 12-month period.
Thank you. Sister, if I could turn to you, please. I want to ask each of the members of the panel, but start with you, about the processes that you have for screening candidates for the seminary. Can you just outline for us, please, what the practice is at Good Shepherd?
Yes. We have a vocation director, and he is presently working with candidates, and he sees them for over a year on a regular basis, monthly, and he discusses with them their desire to enter the seminary and does some beginning assessment of whether or not he believes that they have the capacity and are willing and are ready and are able and willing to be formed. Then after a period of time, if he and the seminarian still believe that the candidate should go forward, then the candidate for the seminary would send in an application form, and the vocation director also writes a report, which we would receive. There are also other documents which have to be provided, police check, medical examination, references from parish priests and from others who have known this individual, who are people who are respected within the community. And so all of this comes in as a packet. And then to date, I look at it and see if there's anything that would need to be filled in, and also our rector looks at it. The rector interviews the candidate. I do an assessment process, which includes an interview, extended interview, and then I have them come in a few half days where they would do the testing, and it all depends on how quickly they can answer the tests, the questions on the tests. And
just stopping you there, are you describing psychological tests?
Psychological tests, yes, thank you.
Thank you.
And there are also questionnaires and things like that, which they fill out, and I give them a couple of packets to take with them. And after all of this process is completed, then I will analyze the data and call them back in and talk with them about what the testing and the interviews are showing, and ask them questions based on their responses, just so that I understand what it is that they're saying and what their positions are on based on various things. So at the end of that, I would write a report, and the report would go to our vocation director, and through him to the Archbishop, and then to our rector.
Thank you.
What sort of things what's this process designed to tell you? What are you looking for?
A number of things. Of course, if there are any psychiatric issues, but that would just be the first, and I would assume that there would not be. Also, what their understanding of themselves and what their relationships with others look like, what their sense of their own identity is. It would tell a bit about their sexuality as well. We have a number of questions in the questionnaire and in the interview in regard to their sexuality. And
you say their sexuality, what do you precisely mean?
Well, what their experience has been in their families as they have grown up in terms of information that they have received, what their experience has been during their childhood and adolescence, whether there's been any sexual abuse, how they developed during their adolescence in terms of their sexuality, what experience they've had sexually. And they're usually very open with answering these questions. And so then if I have any further questions later on, then we clarify that. It could be also, if there is some same-sex attraction, we would talk about that as well. So as long as our policy is, as long as there is no deep-seated same-sex attraction of being homosexual, and the key is on deep-seated, then they would be allowed in, and we would work with them in terms of seeing what is underneath it. Now, we also have people coming in who have not had any sexual experience and who do not really know who they are in terms of their own sexual identity. And so we work with those as well to come to understand that their sexual identity is a part of their whole identity, their psychological identity, their affective aspects of self. So,
what do you mean by deep-seated?
Deep-seated means that if they say, this is who I am, and this is what I want to be, this is what I want to remain, and I'm not interested in exploring this any further. And this is who I am, and if we talk about it, or if you take a look at, if you, or this, for example, the staff would want to take a look at changing me, I don't want to be changed. Well, we're not out to change people. We're out to help people come to understand what their real sexual identity is. And I'll give an example of someone, for example, someone who in their adolescence has had some, or may have been sexually abused at some point, may have had some sexual contact with a man or a young man, and finds that pleasant, pleasing. And he comes to believe that he might be same-sex attracted. And that may be true that he is, deep down inside, but it may not be true. It may be that because, I can recall one young man who had that experience, and he discovered that there were a lot of dynamics within his family which had led to him to be rejecting of his own masculinity. And so if we have a candidate who rejects his masculinity, whatever the basis is, whether he's same-sex attracted or not, then he will not be able to be fully the priest which he is meant to be and able to be. So we look at helping the individual to come to know who he is sexually as a part of his entire identity.
So if the candidate has a deep-seated homosexual orientation, he would be rejected?
I would just say yes, probably because he would not be willing to be formed, to take a look at the underlying issues, just to take a look at them.
And if a candidate reveals a deep-seated heterosexual orientation, what happens to them?
Well, I've not heard of that being a problem.
Sister, the phrase deep-seated homosexual attraction derives from the 2005 direction from the Vatican, is that right?
That's correct.
And so it is having a deep-seated homosexual attraction which disqualifies you from ordination, is that right?
Correct.
Are you trained as a psychologist, or rather, as a psychologist, is there a distinction between a same-sex attraction and a deep-seated homosexual orientation?
Yes, there is a difference.
Thank you. Do you, when you're having these discussions with candidates at the assessment phase that we've been talking about, do you make them aware that having a deep-seated homosexual orientation is a disqualifying factor?
I would assume so. I mean, I would talk with them about it and just discuss with them what it is they're trying to understand, what they're trying to say, so that I know that I understand what it is that they're saying. And as long as we can understand one another, then yes. And I'm not the only one who makes a decision.
Yes.
Okay, it's a discernment process. And so I would write a report. Now, whether or not that report would be agreed with or accepted by the bishop, archbishop, is a different question. Or whether other staff members who meet with them and discuss with them would agree, that's a very different matter.
But in your conversations with the candidates, as you say, where you're making sure that you understand each other, would the candidate be informed and understand that if they do have a deep-seated homosexual attraction, they can't go into the seminary?
Yes.
Thank you. Is there any guidance in terms of policies or anything of that nature that you follow in designing these assessment processes?
I'm sorry, I don't understand your question. Yes.
Does the Church give you any guidance, either at the national level or the archdiocese level, about what kind of psychological assessments you should be carrying out?
No, but I am I'm in regular contact with associates in the United States and in Europe who do psychological testing in seminaries. We have a regular monthly contact call and discuss these issues. So what I do very much follows according to the standards which are in the United States and in Germany, at least, where I have worked in the past.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Is there a requirement imposed by the Archdiocese to conduct some kind of psychological assessment?
Oh, yes, it's it's very much desired by the entire church.
But it's left up to individual seminaries
That's correct.
to how to design that?
That's right.
Thank you. You might have heard, Sister, the evidence of Dr. Robinson yesterday on this topic, and she expressed the view that it was good practice to have this kind of psychological assessment carried out externally rather than internally.
Mm-hmm.
And she suggested two reasons for that. One might be that there might be limits to the expertise within the organisation. The second was that there might be some pressure, whether conscious or unconscious, to accept candidates, and that internally you might be more susceptible to that pressure. Do you have a response to that in terms of your own practices?
I do. And that is, if someone were wanting to enter into the seminary and I would not perceive that he would be appropriate for entering the seminary, I certainly would not want him to be there. And so I don't think that that would color my viewpoint at all, because if he were to come in and he's not really applicable, or he's not appropriate to enter, then he would be miserable and we would be miserable. And so that's the last thing that we would want. So I don't believe that that is an issue. And we are also in the process of talking with another psychologist who might be involved in the future with the assessments from outside of the seminary. And besides that, there are a number of seminarians who come in from different dioceses, including Canberra, Goulburn, Broken Bay, and Wollongong, among others. And so they do testing in their own seminaries, and then we receive the testing that they've done. And based on my assessment of whether or not the assessments that we receive are complete or not, or lacking, then I might do some additional testing, but it's not always necessary.
So if you're receiving a candidate from one of those dioceses, they do the initial psychological assessment themselves?
Yes.
And it's a matter of your own assessment about whether anything further is required?
Yes.
Thank you, Sister. What about the expertise element of what Dr. Robinson said? She was in particular suggesting that there are benefits to having a team of external experts who bring different specialities to the task as opposed to having a single person conduct it. Do you have a view about that?
Well, as I said before, we do have medical reports that are already available to us, and dental records and other. The vocation director has also already had an assessment. Our rector assesses them, and then I do, and if they come from another diocese, then they're also assessed. So we do have a multifaceted system, although I am the psychologist and the buck stops here in that regard. But again, as I said, those who are making the determinations of whether or not the candidate is appropriate, that's above my level.
Thank you. Father Kelly,
before you move on, Sister, as I understand it, you have said to us that in your sexuality psychological testing, the Vatican requires you to have specific regard to whether homosexual tendencies are present. Does the Vatican have or lay a requirement on you to pay specific attention to whether a candidate has a sexual interest in children?
Yes, that question is always involved. We ask whether to children, to adolescents, to someone of the same sex, males, females. We ask all of those questions.
Is that a requirement from the Vatican, or just one you pursue?
Well, that's one that those of us who work together internationally in terms of setting up the assessments, that's from us, but I'm sure also that the Vatican would be desirous of that.
But that doesn't answer answer the question fully for me. As I understand it, the Vatican is specific. You must test for homosexual tendencies, but the Vatican is silent in that same way on testing for children.
Well, I'm not so sure about their silent on that, because they do have a pontifical commission for the protection of children. And I've spoken with them or communicated with them and asked them also if they have any documents on this situation, on the child abuse. And they don't yet, but it's on their books. I mean, it's part of a project they're going to work on, but they do not have, as far as I'm aware, anything that says you must assess that. However, I would think it's an unspoken rule. I don't think it needs to be stated explicitly, because it's so obvious. All of these documents over the past years from our Holy Fathers in regard to the heinous crime of child sexual abuse. I think it's so obvious that they don't say anything really about what the testing must be in assessments in seminaries.
And yet in 2005, they thought it necessary to be prescriptive about homosexual tendencies.
I believe that at that time there was a big question there about where it was said that in some seminaries a number of homosexuals were coming in and were in some ways also abusing others, entering into homosexual relationships with other seminarians, with also with young boys, and so post-pubescent. So that was, I think, in association with that. It was not because of, I mean, I think it's this church's stance on sexuality in regard to child sexual abuse is very clear. And anyone who does not understand that has a big problem in terms of his rational capacity to think.
You said that the Vatican was concerned about homosexual activity with adults within the seminaries and with young boys.
Yes.
That's my understanding.
Adolescents, yes.
They're not concerned about heterosexual candidates with an interest in young boys or young girls?
They are. They are very concerned about that.
And that's an explicit instruction to you?
To me, not directly, but it's explicit in the documents. And there is a document in the United States that the United States Bishop Conference has put out in terms of the role of psychology in the seminaries, and that is in there as absolutely as something that needs to be assessed.
So, Sister, does that, I'm just trying to understand, is the 2005 direction from the Vatican, is it with respect to the protection of children, is that theologically based or psychologically based?
The 2000, which document are you referring to now?
The direction that you're referring to, as I understand it, the distinction between same-sex attraction and deep-seated homosexual attraction in terms of the screening process and the screening out of those who identify as having a deep-seated, using the language that you have used, deep-seated homosexual attraction. So is the screening out of those people based in a theological position or in psychology?
It's in both.
Sorry?
It's in both.
So what's the psychological theory that underpins it?
Well, this is where the theological and psychological relate with one another, because, and it's in the document, and it's in the paper that I wrote also in regard to the natural law, and it gets quite complex, but it has to do with what the laws of nature are, and how the human person needs to follow the laws that God has embedded within us, and that according to these natural laws, that we have the human body, the masculine, the male body, and the female body, and that according to also other deeper theological principles based on, may I have a copy of the document and I can tell you more specifically, because it becomes quite complex.
It's in tab 29, if we could have that up in the hearing bundle.
Sorry, we can't hear you.
I'm sorry, it's in tab 29 in the hearing bundle. There should be a copy come up on the screen in a moment, Sister. Or can we find a hard copy?
If I could have a paper copy, I would appreciate it. Oh,
Fine.
because I can look down it more quickly than if I see it on there. Thank you very much. Because there are different dimensions, so please let me know how far you'd like me to go into this. All right, so I'm sorry, this is only the skeleton. This is not the document that I wrote.
We might perhaps try and find you the longer version.
Because this is,
happy to come back to you.
this just has, thank you, I'm sorry, yes. I'm glad to respond, but I need the
Yes,
information.
but over morning tea, Sister, we'll work out
Thank
the
you.
full document that you need.
Thank you.
Come back to that. Thank you. Father Kelly, can I turn to you, please, and just on this topic of psychological assessment, can you just indicate to the Commissioners, please, where in your process of candidates for the Jesuits psychological testing is carried out?
That testing is carried out after the person has been through a candidacy and is then intending to apply, and then there are a number of interviews with the psychological testing, and that's done externally, and it's a comprehensive 5-hour testing, and so that happens right at the start of the process.
So it's after a period of candidacy and before entering the novitiate, is that?
Yes. So once you've applied and you've been accepted, or once you've applied, then you would be put in this. You would go through these interviews and testing.
Thank you. And at the same time, there are other examiners conducting interviews and preparing.
There are three other examiners, all of whom are Jesuits, and they're fully formed. The first examiner, which follows the psychological one, he usually has a background in psychology as well, and he will ask in similar areas. He will ask questions. And then he also deals with, are there any impediments? He asks those questions around, like, is there any criminality? Is there any abuse? So he also a question on those, and then the second examiner will check out more about the person, the family history, relationships, and that, and then the third examiner will check for the academic suitability, I guess, of the person.
So is sexuality a topic covered by more than one of those examiners?
Yes, by the sexuality is covered by the psychologist and also by the first examiner. But if things come up, they will be asked questions. But yes, generally in the domain of those two.
Do you know what the practice is or the expectation is of those examiners regarding this question of trying to identify deep-seated homosexual tendencies?
Yes.
Is it a topic that's raised?
Oh, yes, it's investigated by the psychologist, yes.
And
we ask that. Because one thing is that, whether you're heterosexual or homosexual, you still have to live the vows and live under the vows. And we like to see in candidacy that the person will actually show evidence of being able to do that comfortably in that period. Because they also will live in community, and if it could be that they could form strong attachments and detachments, so that affects your community life as well, and trying to make for harmony in community. So I think it really does need to be explored, this degree and the management of one's sexual identity and orientation.
Do you also ask the candidates whether they've been involved in seminary training or in any other religious education process?
Yes, that happens.
And what happens if they tell you that they have?
If they tell us that they have, we usually ask them, and we usually inquire of the seminary, the rectors and the people, what's happened, and then why this change and move, what's behind it.
Thank you. Yeah. There's no database, is there, that allows you to independently check?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Are you aware of a database in the United Kingdom that allows that to happen? There's one within the Commission's received evidence suggesting that within the United Kingdom they have a database that allows institutes and seminaries to check whether someone has been a candidate elsewhere.
Right.
You're not aware of that?
No.
Right. Is that something that you think would assist you in assessing candidates?
Certainly, those that have been involved in other formation, yeah.
Thank you. Father Thompson, can I turn to you, please? If we could just reunite you with the microphone. What's the practice at your college in terms of psychological assessment?
If we have serious doubts about the suitability of an applicant, we always insist on the psychological assessment to be done before they come to the seminary. But for the most part, we have it done in the first year, usually in the first 6 months after they come to the seminary. Our first year is very much a probationary year. There's a number of reasons, from those from country areas and those from other countries. Certainly, it's very hard to have the adequate psychological tester to be found. And secondly, once we've got to know the men a little bit, we can also direct the psychologist to look out for certain things that we might sort of have already noticed. So that's the policy. We have a psychologist resident in Wagga, He is a Catholic, but he is a convert to the Catholic faith. But he's also, in his past life, served as a Uniting Church minister. So he does have some understanding of the needs and the challenges of those in ministry.
He's with Centrecare, is he, Father?
That's right, yes.
Just to clarify, is it the case that all of the candidates will receive a psychological assessment, but it just may differ as to whether that occurs before they come in?
That's right.
Thank you. And what is done with the outcome of the psychological testing? Is a report produced?
Yes. The candidate must, of course, sign a release, if you like. The very nature of a psychological test is that it's between the candidate and the psychologist. So he signs a document allowing it to go to the rector and to his bishop and to the vice-rector.
Thank you. And is that report essentially for the purposes of deciding whether or not the seminarian should continue in the seminary?
I tend to use it more as a tool of formation. Certainly if something comes up that we weren't aware of, then we would perhaps look for more information, and we may even take steps to ask the candidate to leave if there was something we thought serious enough. But it's a tool of formation that the psychological test brings out things that we haven't known, or perhaps even were unknown to the candidate himself. We allow the candidate to see the report. Other seminaries don't do that, or some of them don't anyway. And so we can discuss it and perhaps point in directions where perhaps some defect can be worked on, and in some way there could be some healing process.
Do you have any involvement in designing the type of psychological assessment that occurs, or do you just leave that up to the psychologist?
I'll leave that to the psychologist. I've got to admit I know very little about psychology. The psychologists, there was an occasion a couple of years back when the various psychologists who do the testing in the seminaries met together for a 2 or 3 day meeting in Melbourne, I think it was, and they were able to kind of share among themselves what they did and what they thought was necessary and so forth. So there has been some sharing from that point of view, but I'm in no position to sort of dictate what kind of psychological test.
Sure, but can I just ask this question? You've been rector of Wagga Wagga Diocese Seminary for some time.
14 years.
And during that time, there's been a great deal of learning about the characteristics of individuals, priests and religious, that go on to offend.
There's been a great deal of learning. Oh, yes, yes.
So in what way over those 14 years have you identified characteristics that you would be more aware of today that would be troubling to you than they would have been 14 years ago? So what's the learning? You say you don't have a knowledge of psychology, but you've been rector of this facility during a period of enormous learning and revelation. So what would be the characteristics that would concern you today in a young man entering the seminary that may not have concerned you some time ago?
With regard to child protections?
Well, with regard to sexuality, relationships, clericalism, those factors which we have identified that are a context for abuse.
Righto. Certainly a young man who was not able to understand or live by the ordinary boundaries that are laid down in the documents of the Church, that would be a concern. Someone who tended to form small groups. He was not someone who could not mix widely with the larger community, but tend to form some kind of clique, if that's the word. That would be one thing that I would look for. Yes, general signs of lack of self-confidence in the activities of a young man. That would be something I'd be concerned about.
Has there been a more formal understanding amongst seminary leaders about the characteristics that have now been identified in priests and religious that may give rise to later aberrant behaviour, be it boundary violations with adults, be they men or women, or children? Is there now a clear understanding of those characteristics that were present previously and could be present today in candidates going forward? Or is this something that each rector and each seminary comes to a different view about, informed by their own personal experiences? Or is it based on some sort of agreed research evidence and forward-looking approach?
I guess it's, well, we talk among ourselves. My conviction is that priests, seminarians that were to offend in this way, it's not kind of an isolated thing, that you don't find a good holy priest who says his prayers and so forth offending in this area. If there is a kind of a general lack of discipline, a lack of prayer life, a lack of seeming commitment to what the priesthood is all about, that would kind of be a danger sign. And the one great change that has come into seminary formation since John Paul II's Pastoris Debo Verbis is the emphasis on human formation. Human formation is seen as the foundation of all other aspects of formation. If a man is deficient in human relations, in his social balance, his psychological balance, even unable to make friends, or even lacks the ordinary courtesy or good manners and so forth, he can't really build he hasn't got the foundation to build what's necessary for the priesthood. And there will be deficiencies in all kinds of things, and there will be a danger there, I think, that he will offend in more ways than one, including the protection of children.
But your starting premise, Father, is that holiness, as indicated by devotion, prayerfulness, and attendance to the rigours of the life of worship, you believe that that premise would preclude a person from, in fact, offending in the way that we've described?
Human persons always have their freedom, and no one can infallibly predict that someone is not going to offend. But there is a saying that holiness depends on wholeness, and it's sometimes very hard to know the difference. The human virtues, the balanced person, it flows into his prayer life, into his devotion to his duty and so forth.
Yet the evidence would indicate that there are many perpetrators, both within the Catholic and other faiths, who ostensibly were extraordinarily prayerful and devoted. Indeed, in some of the monasteries, they were attentive to their daily requirements to a T. And yet in some of those monasteries, we have very high rates of abuse. And similarly, in the perpetrators that have been reported to the Commission through private sessions, many of those have been regarded as extraordinarily dutiful priests in prayer life and in pastoral life, and yet they offended egregiously. And so, therefore, what would be the evidence that would suggest that?
I would think, to a large extent, the impression that they are loyal, or that they are conscientious to their prayer life and so forth might be just an appearance. I can't see that a man who is seriously coming before the Lord every day in prayer would do something so much against the law of God, and both in the area of chastity and the area of harming children than to abuse.
That sounds like an act of faith, not based on true knowledge.
It is an act of faith, but it's. I think we can act on faith. I'm not ruling it out. I know.
I mean by that, it's just your belief as opposed to having an evidentiary foundation. I don't know whether you heard the evidence yesterday of priests who go to confession and confess and then go away and abuse again. Did you hear that?
My impression is that priests who abuse don't go to confession.
Well, you see that we had evidence to the contrary yesterday.
I'm surprised to hear that.
Well, we all need to look at the evidence, though, I think.
Sister, I think there was something you wanted to add.
Say that I think over the past few years.
Microphone.
I'm sorry. Over the past few years, there's been a lot of research done. For example, Dr. Marshall, William Marshall, has done a great deal of pulling together statistics from abusers and of signs and symptoms that others have observed in their regard. They've been perpetrators. So there was, for example, a lack of emotional maturity and an identification with the age of the child or adolescent that they were of the child that they were abusing, or grooming, for example, grooming behavior. Past sexual abuse is a big one. Narcissism is a big one. Boundary violations, isolation, a lack of good peer relationships, all of those things, and poor social skills. And I think, obviously, that what we call sociopathy of dishonesty and of these cognitive distortions. I mean, that's all true. And I think a lot of it has to do with character formation and a lack of character formation. And so if they're not honest and transparent in terms of who they are and respecting the dignity of others, and if any of these are evident, then I think you have a number of red flags there.
Yes, you and the father might have a chat about those matters. You understand what's being said, but there is a lot of evidence that can perhaps inform the decision-making in this space. We'll take the morning adjournment. Thank you.
Thank you.
All stand.